All right, Matthew, welcome to Module 3, Power and Heart Rate. Same, but different?
Yeah, I've been looking forward to talking about this one actually, because we did a podcast episode on it, and I was hoping it would become like a real heated debate, but we ended up agreeing on a lot of things, right? Because you're coming from running and looking at running power. I'm mostly looking at cycling power.
Yeah.
But they really complement each other, don't they?
Yeah, there's like same, but different. Anyway, let's get into it. What have we got coming up in this module?
So first off, why do we measure anything? Well, we talked about it a little bit before, but we're going to solidify and talk about what some of the things that we look at. Our heart rates go up when we start exercising, and we'll talk about why that happens. Then we'll talk about some of the equipment that we use to measure power especially, and if those measurements are valid, and a little bit about the heart rate power debate. All right, Will, so why would you measure anything as a coach?
Well, it's really to make sure we understand what the athlete is doing, both like within a single training session, across a week, across a month, the load, like zones, all that kind of stuff. It's really like understanding what the athlete is doing and what is happening physiologically. That's why I measure it. Yeah.
A lot of the softwares are going to automatically analyze a lot of the data for us. Like Training Peaks does that, and as for us as coaches, it automatically puts the data in a really usable form for us, so we can just pretty much just look at a ride or run and say, okay, did the athlete meet what we expected to do?
Yeah, that's right. Like at the most simplest form, the athlete presses start, records, presses stop, and then we get what we need to.
Yeah, this graph's pretty nice, and actually this is pretty fantastic ride here for an athlete that was meant to stay in zone 2. So they pretty much spent all of their time in zone 2, which is what we wanted, right? And as a coach, if I'm analyzing this, I can just look at this graph and say, yeah, this is great. I don't need to do a deep dive into this. I'd probably have some questions around some of the time spent in zone 3. Like, why did we spend any time in zone 3 at all? And I could do a deep dive later, but actually this is a pretty good ride just by looking at heart rate. So previously we showed a graph where we talked about the thresholds. So we talked about as exercise intensity increases, there's an increase in the concentration of blood lactate, and that's because we're doing more muscular contractions due to the increased workload. And this is the same kind of thing. So this is what we would see if we were doing a max test on an athlete, which Will and I have done a ton of times in the lab. And they start at a really easy pace, and the pace gets harder every few minutes until they can't go anymore, because they eventually hit their threshold, and then their time is super limited, and eventually they hit their max and they just have to stop, right? So that's what's happening in this graph. And you can see the volume of expired gas increases pretty linearly. We hit a few different thresholds, and these are different thresholds than the one we talked about before, but that's okay, right? There's so many different thresholds, and we said if you just pick a threshold, stick with it, that's all good. So we can see the volume of expired gas. It starts to go up exponentially.
The blue line.
Yep, blue line, corrected for standard temperature and pressure. And then also what we're really interested in, so we know that happens. We know that happens because it takes a certain amount of oxygen to do a certain amount of work. What we also see is we see the heart rate, and the heart rate is increasing linearly as well. So starts kind of at rest. There's usually a little bit of a correction going on as the athlete starts to warm up and get into the work. This athlete probably didn't have a very good warm up at all. But then heart rate increases pretty linearly until they can't go anymore. And it's the same reason.
Dr. Matt and I started the Performance Advantage podcast to help runners, riders, and outdoor competitors integrate sports science more effectively into their training and racing.
So over the last few years, Dr. Will and I have covered topics like the lactate threshold, training zones, power meters, and fatigue. Now we're condensing these popular and misunderstood topics into practical courses.
Our courses take our same podcasting style approach to learning and education, and we break it down into bite-sized chunks that you can digest either all at once or as practical little resources to use as and when you need them.
So the biggest difference between our course and any other course you might have taken is that we don't lecture you. It's a conversation between Will and I, and we're explaining complex sports science principles in an easy to understand manner.
Yeah, we also integrate like how we use them on the regular. Our courses come with a certificate of completion, as well as a lot of takeaway resources such as training plans, scientific articles, and quizzes that you can do to check your progress along the way.
Our sports science courses are available now. Register on performanceadvantagepodcast.com for immediate access.